Now we come to the next hat. The next hat is the green hat. You can think of green as vegetation, growth, energy, branches, sprouts. The green hat is the creative hat. When the green hat is in use, everyone is making an effort to be creative. It is not just a matter of one person in the meeting having ideas and everyone being ready to jump on that person and attack those ideas. Everyone is expected to be creative. Be creative or keep quiet. Creative, we're looking for new ideas. We're looking for alternatives. We're looking for possibilities, and provocation and lateral thinking also come under the green hat. Now, a very, very important word on that list is possibilities. Possibilities is the most important word behind Western progress in science and technology. Many people say our progress is due to information and logical deduction. That is total nonsense, total nonsense. Without possibilities, we would have got nowhere. Why is it so important? Because in science, you have evidence. Then someone comes along with a creative possibility, which we call a hypothesis. That allows us to focus attention, collect more information, design experiments, gives us something to work towards. Now, it's true that knowing that our hypothesis is going to be criticized, going to be attacked, we try harder to build up supporting evidence. But the critical destruction of a hypothesis has never produced a better one. A better one is produced by someone coming along with a new possibility and a new possibility. That is the basis of progress in science. In technology, the possibility is the vision. We have this vision, we can imagine something, and then we try and work towards it. So important is a possibility system that we can see what happens to a major culture which never developed the possibility system. China. 2,000 years ago, China was way ahead of the Western technology. They had gunpowder, rockets, bronze, paper, and so on. Had they continued at the same rate, today China would be far ahead of the West. Highly intelligent people, very, very intelligent people who work and study very hard. Didn't happen. Why? Because at this stage, the technicians were trying things out. Let's try this, let's try that, making progress. Then it got into the hands of the scholars. Now, the scholars were very keen to describe everything. Everything was tied up in description packages. The Chinese never developed the concept of the hypothesis. So their progress came to a dead end. Where did the hypothesis come from? Also came from Greek thinking, but the Greek thinking before the Gang of Three, the pre-Socratic thinkers who were much better thinkers. So the possibility system, very, very important part of the green hat system. Creativity, possibility, very important. Then we come to the last of the hats. The last of the hats is the blue hat. You can think of blue as sky and overview. The other hats are looking at the subject, looking at the content of the thinking. The blue hat is looking at the process itself. The blue hat is standing back, looking at the thinking. Just as the conductor of an orchestra is getting the best out of the orchestra by having the instruments play as they're supposed to play, just as the ringmaster of a circus is organizing which events happen, so the blue hat is looking at the thinking itself, the processes of thinking. The blue hat will say, how do we define the situation? With what do we want to end up? The blue hat is concerned with decisions, summaries, outcomes, next step. Very, very key. So what we have there is these 6 hats. Six hats allow us to think in parallel. So at one moment, instead of traditional argument, A and B may both be wearing the white hat. What information do we have here? Then A and B together might be wearing the green hat. What are the alternatives? What are the ideas? What are the possibilities? Then they might be wearing the black hat, the caution. What might go wrong? What do we need to think about? Then the yellow hat, and so on and so on. So although we're thinking cooperatively, you're still going all around the subject to get a full view of that subject. Now, the advantage of the method is that you're using all the intelligence, all the information, all the experience of everyone at any moment. It is not a matter of people dividing into for and against and so on. Now, of course, people always say, yes, well, I'm thinking of anything, I always look at the pros and cons, a balanced view. When you do experiments and you get people to use the hat explicitly, you get huge changes, 300, 400, even 500% changes, big changes, just by asking people explicitly to do what they claim to be doing. Now, the reasons you get these changes is, one of the main things is what I call separation. That when we're normally thinking, we're trying to do everything at the same moment. For example, we might be being cautious, intuitive, creative, all at the same moment. Here we say, no, let's do one thing at a time. Let's have our mind being creative at one moment, intuitive, cautious, all at different times, not all at the same moment. Now, there is some evidence that the way the brain works, the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain, is different when we're thinking creatively from when we're thinking positively, from when we're thinking cautiously. If this is so, then there's an absolute need to separate out the modes of thinking, because you cannot do all the modes of thinking optimally at any one point. It's rather like if you're playing golf and you have your driver, which is good for long shots, and you have your putter, which is good for putting. You can't say to yourself, well, I don't need all those different clubs. I'm going to have this super club, which is just as good for driving as it is for putting. The answer is you won't get one. It will always be suboptimal on anything. Similarly, when you believe that you're thinking optimally, you never are. You're thinking suboptimally in every different mode. And that is one of the reasons we need to separate out the modes of thinking. And that reason is physiological, the balance of neurotransmitters. So that is one of the values, one of the reasons why we need to use something like the six hats process. Another of the values is to do with ego. That one of the biggest problems in thinking is people's ego. That if you don't like an idea, you're not going to try and find anything in its favor. On the other hand, if you are enthusiastic about an idea, you may not be sufficiently cautious. Now, what happens with a hat system is that if you don't like an idea, when the black hat is in use, you are invited to be as critical as you possibly can. But when the yellow hat is now in use, you are being asked to find the benefits and values in that idea. And if you sit there and say, I cannot see any values, but if people around you are finding values, you are now seen to be deficient, defective, inadequate as a thinker. So you shift from being the macho defender of an idea to being seen as a poor thinker. In other words, we shift attention, we shift the balance from ego behavior to your performance as a thinker. And that's very key. And once people start using the system, the framework, their thinking changes, becomes much more constructive, much more positive. We no longer have the argument mode, which really is a sort of a transfer of a fight or a battle into another mode. We have cooperative, constructive thinking. Now, the framework is very, very simple. I mentioned earlier that it's used from top corporations, their senior executive worldwide, IBM, Prudential, Nabisco, Ford, Texas Instruments, Federal Express, NASA, the space agency use it, and so on and so on. Right down to 5-year-olds in school. So it's something which is very simple to teach and very simple to use. There's nothing complex about it. But there are one or two points which I need to emphasize. One point which is very important is the 6 hats are not, repeat not, repeat not, repeat not, not categories of people. A lot of psychology is obsessed with categories. He's this, she's that, he's this, she's that. Once you put people in boxes, they sink ever deeper, never get out. The 6 hats are absolutely not categories of people. When the hats are in use, everyone at that moment is wearing the same hat. So if the green hat is in use, everyone is metaphorically wearing the green hat. It's not a matter of someone sitting there saying, I am the resident black hat thinker, that's all I'm going to do. Everyone is wearing the same hat. Then the hat will change, everyone changes. Sometimes I've come across people who've been inadequately trained, got the wrong idea, and they say, we've got a meeting, and should we have one purpose? Here, everyone is looking in the same direction, and everyone should be able to use all hats. Just as when you're driving a car, you should be able to use all the gears. You don't say, well, I'm just a first gear driver, or I only know how to drive in the 4th gear. Use all the gears. Indeed, we often find that people who hitherto have considered themselves black hat critical users, given the hat system, they say, fine, I can do that, but I can also do the creative side. And indeed, they enjoy that possibility, they enjoy that holiday from their normal thinking, the ability to think differently. Now, the second point, which is important, is that if we want to change people's behavior, we usually try and change the person. Religion may say, let's make you a better person, then you'll treat other people better. Then along came Freud and says, if we understand your motives, your behavior, your background, your upbringing, we understand why you do things, that understanding may make you behave better. And then you have various forms of training and sensitivity training, make you a better person, you behave better. Now, all those systems are slow and not very effective in changing behavior. So now we might go back for a moment to Confucius from China. Confucius said, what I'm really interested in is how you behave to others. Not so much what your psyche is, how you behave. How you behave to your family, to your subordinates, to your superiors, to your colleagues, and so on. Get your behavior right, and the rest will follow. Now, the 6 hats mode is in that direction. If you are an aggressive person, the 6 hats is not going to say to you, don't be aggressive. But if the yellow hat is in use, then be aggressive, but you have to use your aggression in a positive, constructive fashion. So by going straight to behavior, you can get big, big changes. You're not trying to change people first in order to get different behavior. You're going straight to behavior. Now, there are 2 broad ways of using the hats. The first way is what I call occasional. Occasional, as it implies, is the use of a single hat, one at a time. You might be having a discussion, an argument or something of the sort, and at a certain point you feel you need new ideas, you need fresh alternatives. So you say, right now, for 3 minutes, let's have some green hat thinking. That indicates 2 things. Let's have some deliberate creative thinking, and let's all think in parallel for that time. At the end of that time, you can get back to your conversation, discussion, argument, whatever it was. Later on, you might get to a point where you have a suggestion and you need to assess the risks. So you say, let's have some black hat thinking for a limited period of time. So occasional means the use of a single hat in order to ask for a mode of thinking. This can become part of the language of a school, of a family, of an organization. So at any moment, whether it's a family argument or discussion or in school and you're treating a subject, you can say, right now, let's have some green hat thinking on this. Now, because the colors of the hats are artificial, it allows you to ask for a big change in thinking very sharply. If you just said to yourself, or to others, don't be so negative, or let's be more creative or something, that is very weak. Because people take it personally if you say don't be negative, but with the hats it's abstract, it's impersonal, it's remote. You can say it's very good black hat thinking, now let's have some yellow hat thinking. So what you do with the hats, it gives you a language, a symbology for switching thinking as often as you like and as sharply as you like. And that's one of its great advantages. It gives you a way of handling thinking, putting strategy into thinking. Then the second way we can use the hats is the systematic way. Systematic means we put together an agenda, a program of hats, and use them one after the other, going through them sequentially. Now, how much time do we spend under each hat? That will depend on how many people are on the group, but it's much, much better to set a short time, maybe as short as 3 minutes. But if at the end of 3 minutes you're still getting caution ideas, you extend the time as necessary. Much better to set a short time and extend it than to set a long time and sit around wondering what to think next. Now what we find is that with the hats, because the method is so fast, you can say a great deal in a very short time. Because in normal thinking, when someone says something, you are obliged to respond to what has been said, even if only out of politeness. With the 6 hats system, everyone at every moment is thinking about the subject. The ideas are put down in parallel. You do not agree or disagree, you put it down in parallel. So much, much faster. Now, in terms of the systematic use, there are 2 broad approaches to setting up the sequence. The first approach is what we might call preset. Preset means you put the sequence of hats together before you start, and then you go through that sequence one after the other. Preset. Second type is evolving. Evolving means you choose the first hat, and when you've finished with that, you choose the second, and when you've finished with that, you choose the third. Now, I would advise you against evolving until you are very familiar with the framework. The reason is that you will spend so much time arguing about which hat to use next, you won't have much time to think about the subject. So now there's no one right sequence. You can use each hat as often as you like or not at all. There's no one right sequence. The sequence will vary a lot depending on the subject that is being considered. Generally speaking, you would always start with the blue hat. The blue hat at the beginning is to say, what are we thinking about? If it's a problem, what are alternative definitions of the problem? The blue hat is there to say, with what do we want to end up? The blue hat is there to set the agenda of hats as you go through. So the blue hat is setting up the situation. What are we here for? What are we doing? What type of thinking is it? Is it problem solving? Is it exploration? Is it design? Similarly, at the end, we have another blue hat, which is like the other bookend, and this blue hat says, what have we achieved? Under this blue hat, we make decisions, outcomes, we design the next steps, and so on. Now, very often people say to me, all this is exploration, how do we make the final decision? What in practice very often happens is by the time you've got to the end, the decision has made itself. Because if we look at it, what is decision making? Decision making means directing our attention to the consequences of a choice, to our feelings, to our values, and making a decision. But if all these have been laid out under the hats, the decision has actually designed itself. So when you come to the end, the decision is very often self-evident. Because if we look at it, what is decision making? Decision making means directing our attention to the consequences of a choice, to our feelings, to our values, and making a decision. But if all these have been laid out under the hats, the decision has actually designed itself. So when you come to the end, the decision is very often self-evident. Last year in England, there was a write-up on the 6 hats in the Financial Times, and the following week I had a letter from a fellow who said he was in the country with his wife and they couldn't decide whether to buy this particular house or not. And they'd been arguing about it for 2 or 3 hours. He then said to his wife, let's try that 6 hats thing I read about in the paper last week. And they tried it. He said within 3 minutes they had a decision. In other words, laying things out clearly, rather like laying out a roadmap, the decision is often self-evident. So blue hat at the beginning, blue hat at the end. In between, it will vary with what is being done. For example, if you are assessing something, then you would start with the yellow hat, because if under the yellow hat, when you're making your strongest effort to find benefits and values, if you cannot find many benefits and values, that is the end of it. There is no merit in that idea. You don't even need to use the black hat. But if under the yellow hat you find lots of benefits and values, and then you come to the black hat, and now you find lots of problems and difficulties and so on, at least now you're motivated to overcome those problems because you have seen the benefits. But if you start off with a black hat before you've seen any benefits and you find a lot of problems and difficulties, you're going to dismiss that idea without ever having explored the benefits. So in general, in assessment, it makes sense to start with the yellow hat. After the black hat, you may then use the green hat, even if you're using it elsewhere, to see how you can overcome some of those difficulties. Some of them you can immediately say we can overcome so-and-so. Some of them you can't. You have to note the ones you can't, come back to it later, think about that particular point. If it's a neutral situation, after the first blue hat, you may want to use the white hat. Let's lay out the information. Then you may want to use the green hat. Let's think of alternatives, possibilities. Then you may explore those alternatives and possibilities with a black hat and with a yellow hat on each of them. If it's a situation where you believe that there are strong feelings, strong emotions, after the first blue hat, you may want to use the red hat. For example, before the elections in South Africa, they asked me to teach the 6-hat system, the framework, to the heads of all the peace accord committees in the different townships in South Africa, and they had to solve all the local problems, and they always would start with the red hat. Let people sound off, let them express their feelings, let them express their emotions, and then there was no need to try and feed these into everything for the rest of the meeting. So in that case, you start with the red hat. Get your feelings out on the table. You can use the red hat later. Later, you can feed in a red hat to see if the feelings have changed or if they are still the same. So, red hat. There wouldn't be any point in starting with the red hat if there were not existing feelings, because you wouldn't ask people to adopt feelings if they were not already there. Also, in a few cultures, there's a danger that if you start with the red hat and the senior person, teacher or boss, expresses his or her feeling, there's a danger that everyone may just try and agree with that feeling. In that case, don't start with the red hat. Towards the end of the thinking, you would, of course, have your blue hat at the end. And usually, if any sort of action or suggestion is made, at some point you would want the black hat. What are the dangers? What are the risks? What is the downside? After the black hat, You may also insert a red hat. Now, if the black hat says that's a bad idea, but the red hat says, I still like it, that doesn't mean that you're going to override the black hat. What it means is you may dismiss that particular way of carrying out the idea, but say, but I still like the fundamental idea, in which case you go back to the beginning and try to design a better way of using that idea. Even at the end, after your final blue hat, which is your conclusion hat, you may also put in a red hat. The red hat says, what do we feel about our thinking? What do we feel about our thinking on that subject? Are we happy with it? Do we feel we're still uncertain? Do we feel we didn't do it justice? And so on. So the red hat is permission, legitimacy to express feelings, emotions, and so on. Now, of course, those will vary with different cultures. If in Japan someone says, I'm not totally happy with your idea, that means that person thinks it's the worst idea they've ever heard. In other cultures, unless you say that's the lousiest idea you've ever heard, people think you quite like it. So the level at which emotions are pitched will vary from culture to culture. But the red hat gives you permission to express your feelings, your intuition. So what I've been talking about is a very simple tool, a very simple framework, so that instead of trying to do everything at once, we separate things out and do them one after the other. This is not difficult to do. There are many hundreds, thousands of schools using it from the age of 5 up, not just up to adult, but up to adults in very senior positions. I just mentioned one example before. For instance, another example is Prudential Insurance in the United States, by far the biggest insurance group in the world. And at one time, their chief executive, Ron Barbaro, and he used to use the 6 hats all the time. At any meeting, he said, this is the best way of getting the best value of the thinking of the people involved. So we're looking at right up to senior adults. Very good in conflict situations. In South Africa, the Sowetan newspaper, which is the biggest black newspaper in Africa, I think, they could never get agreement at editorial board level. They adopted the hat principle. Now they use it at every meeting. In Paris, France, every month there's a meeting between the farmers who grow the vegetables and the people who sell them at the market in Paris. These were always very acrimonious adversarial meetings. The farmers used to accuse the marketers of not getting a good enough price. The marketers used to accuse the farmers of not producing good enough quality. Someone introduced the hats. They had the best meeting they've ever had. Now they use that framework for all their meetings. One time in Florida, Apple Computer had a meeting which apparently was in total chaos. They introduced the hats, made sense, and got a very valuable meeting. So we're looking at a very simple, very usable framework. Now, the point which I want to emphasize is this does not mean that our traditional argument system is bad, any more than the front left wheel of a car is bad. It is excellent, but by itself it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient. I don't have to say that's a bad wheel in order to say we need other wheels as well. Now, what the 6 hats framework does is that instead of argument, instead of just drift, instead of confusion, instead of trying to do everything at once, we can have parallel thinking. The fact that the hats have colors on our hats is only a mental framework which enables us to do it. There's nothing magic about it, but if you said, let's have critical thinking or let's have positive thinking, creative, very weak. The framework of the hats makes it much more direct, much more tangible, sticks in the mind. And as I say, it's usable literally from 5-year-olds up to adults at very senior positions. That's why around the world, in different countries, different schools, many teachers, both primary and secondary, are now using the hat system. For instance, we at Singapore, there's two people who run a school for thinking there on Saturday mornings, and they found that these were youngsters about 8 or 9, and they'd asked them to write on a particular subject in the beginning. And the youngsters would write 2 lines on the subject. Once they had the 6 hats framework, they would write 40 lines on that subject. Huge changes, because the hats allow you to scan your experience much more fully, as I said with the explorer going to a situation. So we're looking at a framework which works very well, a simple tool that is increasingly widely used. And now I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I'll take some of the questions you may ask and try and answer them. So at this point, I'm going to stop my talk, and just to say that I've been looking at, indeed you've been looking at with me, a very simple framework for parallel thinking, constructive thinking, creative thinking, cooperative thinking, called the 6 thinking hats. So now I'll take some questions.